So the web plate is a very dull serial. Envisioned to be the Daleks of Season 2, it ends up falling short, and when I say short, I do mean short. The serial was very costly for the show and got a large marketing push, giving it a much higher viewership than anyone familiar with it to expect it to have. But is it as bad as its reputation suggests, or at least as dull? Let's find out. But before that, I have to admit that this is the first serial I'm not especially enthused about reviewing, for obvious reasons. 6-parters in Doctor Who, especially the black and white era, tend to be a bit drawn out compared with the 4-parters, but the web plate is the first where it feels like it should have been considerably shorter, while somehow managing to feel too full to actually trim down. So with that out of the way, let's get into the serial. So beginning a short time after the Romans, the TARDIS is being pulled down to the planet Vortis, inhabited by, depending on your point of view, giant ants or regular sized ants. They're giant by Earth standards, but for Vortis the planet is home to many human-sized insect-like aliens, so take your pick. In reality, these are ant-like creatures called Zarbi, who for whatever reason don't appear on the scanner. I mean, I know the scanner isn't focusing on one point, but there are no Zarbi or their lava gun anywhere to be seen, despite being right outside. Anyway, so the TARDIS is being drawn with its power, meaning the Doctor and Ian must go out to investigate. Due to the thin atmosphere, they have to wear atmospheric density jackets, which are jackets with metal things which blow air into your face. They're not explained, but that is my interpretation. Plus the Doctor gets a hat with his. This is where they run into a problem. Without power, they can't open the doors, something Ian takes odd delight in pointing out.
How do we open the doors? We have no power.
The Doctor, of course, calmly assesses the situation, tries the switch, ponders his next line, and looks at his ring.
Yes, well, I didn't want to,
Here we learn that the ring which the Doctor wears is not just a decorative object, but has some sort of power. What power? Well, we'll have to wait and see. But for the moment the Doctor is able to use it to open the doors. Somehow. He waves his hand in front of what is either a sensor, or as I always keep thinking, a light. This opens the door somehow. I'll discuss the Doctor's ring later, as I think it's quite interesting within the show's history, and maybe the most interesting bit of this serial, bar a few moments. With the Doctor and Ian able to get outside, Ian loses his gold pen.
Try my pen.
Oh, that's very clever. Very clever. You know you've never done that before. That's a remarkable conjuring trick.
And soon after loses his tie when the Doctor dips it into a pool of acid. Interestingly, he's wearing his tie as a belt, which while an actual thing, it seems very odd of Ian to do, and there's no reason why he couldn't just be wearing it like an actual tie as he usually does. And it's not like he needs a belt anyway, as despite everything he does in this serial, this one action never comes back to haunt him. Well, on screen. You do find with a boring serial that you focus on the most mundane of things. Vicky has got a headache due to an ultrasonic noise, so she's being treated in the TARDIS by Barbara, through means of aspirin. I do quite like this scene, like when Vicky called Barbara old in the rescue. It gives a good sense of perspective of how one day we will be a part of history. Vicky is cautious of the aspirin and compares it to using leeches.
It looks a bit medieval.
What do you mean?
Well, you wouldn't like it if I wanted to stick leeches all over you, would you?
This is one of those eye-opening moments, where you realise that one day we'll be viewed in the same way as we view the people of the past. A very existential thought. Fortunately the serial doesn't linger on this, and I do find this bit funny, intentional or not, the reveal that the medicine is aspirin.
Well, he must have picked them up on his travels then, because I'd never seen aspirin before.
The fact the Doctor uses a drug from the 20th century is kind of funny, and it's a great subversion to what you'd expect to be some futuristic medicine from the future. This scene also gives us more information about Vicky's time, in terms of the future of schools, shown by how Vicky believes Barbara taught at a nursery due to the, by her standards, basics of the subjects.
We worked upwards from the 3 R's. Reading, writing, arithmetic.
Oh, it was a nursery school.
It was not.
Oh.
But it goes further as we learn how much Vicky learned at a very young age, noting she was 10 when she took medicine, physics, chemistry and seemingly more, as she is cut off by Barbara. We also learn that there are no such things as classrooms, and instead people learn through machines for nearly an hour a week. But again, Barbara cuts Vicky off before we can learn any more about how these machines work.
How long did you study?
Almost an hour a week. We had these machines.
This discussion reaches its end on a humorous note when Vicky gives in and Barbara makes a joke about her being more primitive to Vicky.
Well, why don't you just pander to my old-fashioned medieval superstitions and take them for me?
It's good to see more of Barbara and Vicky's dynamic at play here. As while they did interact at the start of the Romans, they spent the majority of that serial separated and so haven't interacted much, on screen at least, since they first met in the rescue, where Barbara killed Vicky's pet. I like how they have a dynamic where Vicky is inadvertently calling Barbara ancient and she just has to deal with the potential existentialism that comes with time travelling with someone from the future. Moving along from that heavy subject, Barbara finds that her arm is trying to act on its own, and the TARDIS constantly spinning around wildly, proving it's screwed in. Barbara succumbs to whatever power is controlling her arm, and leaves the TARDIS, being guided towards the pool of acid which the Doctor and Ian found before. The Doctor and Ian can hear the echoes of the girls screaming, but while attempting to return to the TARDIS, Ian gets trapped in a web-like thing, leaving the Doctor to go and get help for him too. But when the Doctor reaches where the TARDIS landed, the ship is gone, seemingly having been dematerialised by Vicky. And we get this great shot where the camera zooms in to a close-up of Hartnell's face, as we see the Doctor afraid without his ship. Now this is a great cliffhanger where there's a sense of danger for everyone, and the shot of the Doctor is iconic. But I have to admit that when I first saw a clip of this, I thought the Doctor was in his pyjamas. Because of this, for a few years I imagined the webplot as a surreal dreamscape where the characters had landed while asleep or something, with them perhaps being drawn out of the TARDIS before changing. Then I watched it, and that wasn't the case. But I do still love the idea of the Doctor exploring an alien planet in his pyjamas in the middle of the night, and it's all this shot's fault for raising my hopes. So back to what we actually have. It turns out that the TARDIS did not in fact take off, as instead was dragged away, leaving tracks which the Doctor and Ian find after Ian escaped from the web. Considering how easily Ian escaped from the web, it really doesn't hold much weight as a threat. All it did was make his face sting a bit. So I have to say that I think episode 2 is where we see a dip in quality. While episode 1 wasn't anything too special, I think there are some pretty good moments, and there is a hook. The fact we don't know anything about the planet makes it interesting. But then the middle section of the serial is far slower. We get introduced to a few elements in each episode, and it feels very slow. We do meet the Menoptera in episode 2, then the Animus in episode 3, with it introduced as the cliffhanger of 2, but these episodes feel very empty. I'll start with Barbara, as her story gets a break in episode 3, and so this will make it easier to talk about. Starting with her approaching the pool of acid, seemingly Azabi orders her to go around it from how it's presented on screen, although this doesn't seem to line up with how we know the brain control works later. But this is where we meet the Menoptera, who finding Barbara, take her to a cave where they are operating from, and remove her golden bracelet, which she had previously received from Nero, freeing her mind. So the Animus, the evil being controlling the Zabi, is able to use gold to control stronger minds, such as humans or the Menoptera, often using these wishbone-looking things to paralyse Vicky later. The Menoptera are a race of giant butterfly-like people who once lived on Vortis, but when the Animus arrived and spread its evil, they fled toward the planet's new moons, Pictos. They remain there for centuries, where they develop weapons to fight the Zabi and the Isotope, which they believe can kill the Animus. The group which Barbara meets are a small scouting party, and are to be followed by a larger spearhead to attack and reclaim the planet. Like the Zabi, the Menoptera are basically just giant insect-like creatures, but unlike the primitive Zabi, are capable of speech, allowing them to have personalities, which makes a few of them memorable, beyond just being the one with main character A or B. The most interesting thing about them is their movements. The serial goes for an ambitious ethereal feel, best shown by the use of the Vaseline filter, which creates a strange light effects on the screen. But the Menoptera move in a strange way, kind of how you imagine insects on Earth communicating. These movements, along with their strange speech patterns, were created by choreographer Rosalind D. Winter, who impressed the production team and so was cast as the Menoptera Vestrin. Getting back to the scouting force, they are hiding from the Zabi and are trying to warn the spearhead that their weapons are useless, but they are discovered. Vestrin escapes, one is killed and another has his wings removed before being taken to the Crater of Needles, this Menoptera being called Hrostar. And yes, I am googling all these names, they are called by them in the episodes, but for the life of me I can't remember any of them or how to pronounce them. Now Jacqueline Hill had a holiday during episode 3, so doesn't appear again until episode 4, but uniquely she isn't credited for episode 3, unlike all other holidays where the actors would still be credited despite not appearing. This is something she complained about to the production team and asked for her name to be reinstated for overseas sales, but this didn't happen. With Barbara captive, we'll get back to the others, who've reunited in the Animus's control room? It's not given a name in the serial, but I need a name for it, so that's what it's called. Nothing much of interest happens here other than Azabi going into the TARDIS and unable to comprehend the larger inside, rushes back out. We do get another great cliffhanger where the camera goes into close-up on Hartnell as a tube blows over his head and the Animus speaks with him.
Why do you come now?
Now I don't want to say that the Animus is an idiot, but this cliffhanger is such a tease, as it gives the sense of the Animus knowing the Doctor or perhaps his people. But no, it thinks the Doctor is one of the Menoptera. While a great cliffhanger, the resolution is lacklustre, perhaps a missed opportunity in fact. Given the Doctor early in the serial was able to identify which planet they were on, the idea of him having been there before, perhaps encountering the Animus in some other form, would have been very interesting and increased the stakes with this history we don't know. But no, it's just a line for a cliffhanger. Moving on from the cliffhanger, there's somehow a lot and very little to cover in the Doctor, Vicky and Ian's plotlines for the next few episodes. The Animus doesn't believe the Doctor, and so as a demonstration of power shoots some Zabi. Okay, it actually shoots the TARDIS, but until I was checking the details of the scene, I never realised it was the TARDIS being shot at, as there is an explosion around the Zabi, quite some distance from the TARDIS. But anyway, we learned that when Vicky was messing with the console previously, she somehow realigned the fluid links, which restored the TARDIS's power, allowing for the shields to be raised. Wait, what? So the power drain wasn't being caused by the Animus, and instead by the misaligned fluid link, which the Doctor actively knew about as he seems very aware of how the issue was fixed. So they could have left at any time they wanted. This feels very Season 1 to me. In fact, it's basically the reason they couldn't leave in the Daleks. But this time the Doctor is far more subtle about what the problem actually is. But how did the fluid link become loose? And why didn't the fault locator indicate the fluid link was misaligned? Something it did in the Daleks? But what makes all this even worse is that the ship is being held on Vortis by the Animus. So what even is the point of the power drain in the first place, as they couldn't leave anyway? So enough of that rant, there will definitely be a few more later on. The Doctor tries to bluff the time by pretending to help the Animus locate the Menoptera's main invasion force. He is allowed access to the TARDIS with Ian. A few things happen here. First, Ian treats the stinging of his face, when the Doctor gets out a vial of tablets, which will assist with their breathing in the rarefied atmosphere of Vortis. Now these tablets are just padding to the scene. The Doctor gives them to Ian to make sure that Barbara is given some, but anyone who knows the serial knows that Ian and Barbara don't see each other until the end of episode 6, meaning Barbara managed slave labour, a considerable amount of running and combat while not being able to breathe properly. I'm not sure if I should be impressed or annoyed by this. Anyway, the Doctor uses an astral map to help with his ploy, and while I have no problems with this device, I do want to note one specific thing. When the Doctor and Ian are bringing it out of the TARDIS, Ian goes to unplug it and the Doctor stops him, saying,
No, don't unplug it. You must never do that. You must never break the time and relative dimension link.
Now, anyone familiar with Chekhov's gun knows that this is a setup. We are being given this information so that later it can be acted on. The thing is, it never is. There is no reason for this line or even for it to be plugged in. So anyway, the Doctor is able to get the Animus to shut the control room down due to the interference it is causing for the astral map. This though is in fact a ploy so that Ian can escape and go to find Barbara. This is successful, but instead Barbara, Ian ends up meeting Vestrin. They share a nice conversation about the Plaid Vortis before being a part of a really dodgy cliffhanger where they fall into a pit. This leads them to meet the Optera, an underground race of insects who evolved from the Menoptera, who stayed on Vortis when the Animus arrived. Now when it comes to the Optera, according to YouTuber Mr. TARDIS, they were introduced to the script by Dennis Spooner and Richard Martin 24 hours before filming of episode 5, due to so little happening in the serial and Maureen O'Brien getting frustrated due to how little her character was doing. Now I can't find any source to back this up, and unless he's referring to pre-filming and not the actual recording session, then I'm extremely confused. But it does make sense looking at what we've been given so far. Assuming that this is in fact correct, then presumably Ian and Barbara were originally meant to meet up, rather than having separate plot lines. This would explain why Ian does nothing for the greater chunk of the serial, and why after the scenes in the Crater of Needles, Barbara has no problems with the rarefied atmosphere. This is of course all headcanon with no proof to back it up, but it seems pretty realistic given what is happening in the serial, although I am relying on the fact that the pills aren't just another failed Chekhov's gun, like the cable for the astral map. So as I've just made clear, Ian's plotline has little to do with the plot, plus not a lot actually happens in it. Ian and Vestrin, having met the Optera, spend the entirety of episode 4 trying to gain their trust before heading towards the Animus, so that they can kill it. In fact, I'm relatively sure that there are only 2 scenes in the caves with the Optera in episode 4, once the cliffhanger has been resolved, and the actual decision to go to the Animus happens halfway through episode 5. This leads to a rather boring trek through some caves where the only things of interest that happen are Ian holding up the roof where it's about to collapse in on them, and one of the Optera sacrificing herself to stop the flow of acid from killing all of them. And until Ian reaches the Animus at the end, that's it for him. We'll move back to Barbara now, as she's back from her holiday and is now in the Crater of Needles. Now while more happens with Barbara than Ian, there's still not too much. She meets a few Menoptera who have been held captive, and together they escape to warn the Spearhead, which fails. One of the Menoptera she meets is called Prapelus, who is an expert on the Zarbi, with his knowledge being useful for their escape, and later attack on the Animus' headquarters. The other Menoptera is Helena, the daughter of Prapelus, who I can't remember a thing about. Admittedly, that's partly because the Menoptera aren't that interesting as both as species or as characters, with me never being able to remember which one is which. In fact, during the attack on the Animus in episode 6, Hrostar is killed, and I didn't know if it was him or Prapelus until the very end of the episode. This does mean that the one male Menoptera I was ever sure of is Helio, most likely because he is the one with wings, but more importantly, he was played by Martin Jarvis, and so just stuck out. So Helio was the only survivor of the Spearhead, as it was completely destroyed by the Zarbi, who had learned the location of the landing site, and so were able to ambush them. This leads to Barbara's group finding an ancient and abandoned temple by complete accident, which they hide in, until being found by the Doctor and Vicky. What luck! I should probably explain how the Doctor and Vicky found them. Well, after a series of long and boring scenes of the Doctor trying to outplay the Animus and buy time, the two of them are able to nullify the Animus's control over a piece of gold, which the Doctor is able to gain control over with his ring, and so by giving it to Zabi, they are able to escape. Note how I don't actually explain how they found them. With them reunited, they plan a two-pronged attack against the Animus's headquarters. The Doctor trades his ring for the isotope, so he can use it on the Animus, with Propellus taking the ring to use to control the Zabi. Like with everyone else, he asks about the ring's power.
May I know its secret?
You may not.
The Doctor is also very reluctant to hand over his ring, which is quite the difference to when he traded it in the Reign of Terror. In a situation he was far less likely to ever see it again. But anyway, the Doctor and Vicky return to the control room, where they are captured and sprayed with webbing. And like with the first two cliffhangers, this one is really strong. Less for the plot and far more so for the imagery. The two of them huddled together with the webbing over them as the camera slowly moves away. And in the following episode, there is a sense that this had a weakening effect on the two of them, as the Doctor seems powerless and somewhat frozen in place, with Vicky only just able to move. For some reason, Vicky decides to put the isotope in the astral map, seemingly only to pad out the episode, as there really is no reason to do this, as they're never searched or anything like that. Given the fact that they are taken to the Animus right after she does this, means that instead of defeating the Animus, the episode just keeps going. I will admit though that the Animus has a very interesting design. It's so alien when compared to everything else. A sort of organic computer perhaps. A massive glowing orb surrounded by tentacles which grab at the Doctor and Vicky and begin to absorb them. Combined with the great performance of Catherine Fleming as the voice of the Animus, and it's a very striking creature. Sadly, its presence in the serial is extremely limited, with it not doing a whole lot. But the expanded universe has expanded on this creature immensely, with it becoming what is known as a Great Old One, being a creature that comes from the pre-universe. But this review doesn't apply to that, and so on screen it's pretty lacklustre as a threat, despite being visually interesting and unique compared to the other enemies the Doctor has faced so far. Barbara launches her attack with the Menoptera. And really that's it outside of a few arguments about who is going to fight the lava guns first. They make it to the control room and attempt to use the astral map to warn the main Menoptera force and end up finding the isotope. So to cut a long story short, they make their way to the centre and attempt to use the isotope against the Animus, although it doesn't appear to work. Oh and yeah, Ian's here, just arriving in time to save the day. Now I always forget how this final confrontation occurs. Due to Barbara seemingly being unable to destroy the Animus with the isotope and Ian's sudden arrival, I always manage to think that Ian uses it instead, given that Ian has done nothing for the past 3 episodes and just arrived for the final battle. Plus, it's the 60s with a male writer. Everything says that Ian is going to be the hero. But no, that doesn't happen. Instead, the isotope suddenly works and Barbara is in fact the one to defeat and kill the Animus. That's another one for Barbara's kill count. With Vortis saved, the Menoptera return and the Zabi go back to being primitive animals. The Doctor's ring is returned, and here is where I'm going to talk about it. Briefly, as I have a bigger conversation about it later in the show. But for the time being, the Doctor's ring is not explained despite everyone asking. The power it has is never explained, and it feels like a massive plot device, given it can open the TARDIS doors without power and control the Zabi under the right conditions. Obviously, it becomes a lot more important than it was last season, where it was just a ring which was clearly valuable, but for unknown reasons, and now it becomes a tool with abilities which the show will expand upon. Eventually. To be honest, it does feel a bit of a silly inclusion, given that the TARDIS didn't need its power to be drained in the first place, meaning the door opening scene wasn't needed, and there's plenty of ways around the controlling of the Zabi. Given the gold is still in play, it means that there is already an item which can be used. So the ring just becomes an odd whatever the plot needs tool for the Doctor. I do have plenty more to say about it, but as I said, that'll come later. But I wanted to address its strange presence in this story now. To wrap things up, with the conflict resolved, the quartet finally reunited, return to the TARDIS, and the ship leaves for the next planet. Thank God! So before I do my usual conclusion, I want to discuss a point I made back at the start. I referred to this as the Daleks of Season 2. The big serial which introduces an iconic enemy for the Doctor, at least in intention. I referred to Mr. Tyus' video on this serial before, and I want to expand on the comment he made. That being, it feels like the webplate is trying so hard to copy the Daleks that they even brought in one of that serial's directors, Richard Martin. The story even borrows more from Terry Nation, specifically Keezer Marinus' acid pools. I find this interesting because after watching, I noted several similar plot points within the serial to the Daleks, and coincidentally even an idea which Nation would later use. For a quick fire list of a few, we have the fluid link preventing the TARDIS from leaving, the atmosphere of the planet being dangerous to the quartet, kinda, Ian travelling through caves to attack the enemy with a surprise attack, The Doctor and Susan/Vicky escaping from the enemy before being recaptured during an attempted attack. The Doctor and Susan/Vicky being powerless for the majority of the final battle. There are definitely more, generally stuff which happens during Ian's cave scenes and others, but I don't want to bore you. As for the idea which Nation would use later, that's the TARDIS being drained of its power, which would be a plot point in Death of the Daleks nearly a decade later. Funnily though, this is a plot point that both serials share with the Masters of Luxor, which was replaced by the Daleks in production. I just think this is a funny coincidence. It's just a shame the serial doesn't borrow the being good bit from the Daleks. But at least it wasn't 7 episodes. So the Web Planet has a reputation, and I think it's justified. It's a very ambitious production, and while I think the production team does for the most part pull it off, the visuals and costumes work is mostly strong, but a lot of that work is basically making insects bigger rather than creating new and unique designs. Despite the overall quality, the serial received a high viewership due to the marketing push with the first episode getting 13.5 million viewers, the highest of the black and white era, but this dropped to 11.5 million by the last episode. Behind the scenes there are a few things of note. Notably it was during the production of this serial when William Russell decided to leave the show, but we also have the fact that one actor who auditioned for the role of a Menoptera was Peter Purvis, who was rejected due to Richard Martin thinking he was too talented for the role of a rubber-suited monster, but this would lead to Martin keeping Purvis in mind and casting him in the chase, leading to him getting the role of Stephen Taylor, but that's a story for another day. Overall, the ambition of the production team was high, and while they did a good job, given the script they were having to make, I think it was a waste of talent and money. I don't have anything against the serial personally. Perhaps it being shorter it could have been not great but a far easier and more worthwhile watch. There are the occasional highlights, such as Barbara and Vicky's conversation and the few fun lines. But that's not enough to make it memorable. If episodes 2 through 6 could have been condensed into 3, then this would have had a much better pace and eliminated the serial's biggest problem. It's just long and dull. With things at their lowest so far, can the bar be lowered further or will the next serial bring the quality back up? Only a few months after his departure as script editor, David Whittaker is back with a historical. Next time, The Crusade.